Through many of our pushing and pulling patterns, especially the ones in upright position, which is going to be most of them, we're going to use either a ipsilateral stabilization strategy or a contralateral. Contralateral will help drive more thoracic rotation. Ipsilateral will create more stabilization on one side of the body. And here's what I mean by that. So Emily, step out with your right side, please. And then what we're going to do is have her bring her right arm straight out. So imagine she's going to do a pulling pattern, so maybe like a cable row pattern. Her right leg is out here, her right arm is straight out like this, so we're creating stabilization on one side of her body. Now with this arm, she would pretend like she's grabbing a cable here, and as she goes into the row position, this arm, her left arm, drives thoracic rotation through that motion, relatively speaking. Again, she may not be moving her thorax a lot, but the right side is definitely stationary. She's got stabilization here. She's resisting me pushing forward or pushing her back, and she's got stabilization down here. Neither side here is moving. Most of the motion, or all the motion, is coming through the left side of her arm. So this is ipsilateral stabilization, and it's a great way to create stabilization if the client has lost stabilization between the right side of the scapula and the pelvis. So if you see somebody that's sort of collapsed down, so bring your legs back to parallel. If they're sort of collapsed down to one side like that, and you want to create a more elongated position and stabilized position, we can create this ipsilateral sort of stabilization pattern where now we're teaching her to connect the thoracolpelvic canister, resist this motion. She can even push into a machine or object, or even push her hand down on top of a foam roller to create that ipsilateral stabilization pattern, and then drive motion of her thorax with her opposite arm. And she's working the connection from also this left shoulder through her thoracolpelvic canister. Now we can also use a contralateral pattern. So now keep your right arm up like this, and now what we'll do is we'll switch her leg positions. So now she's got stabilization through the left hip and the right shoulder. So now we got contralateral stabilization. So it's across those oblique chains, from this anterior oblique chain and this posterior oblique chain coming from her right shoulder down to her left hip. So again, she's going to push and resist me pushing her back, which creates elongation through her spine. And now if she's still doing the same cable row, she can row, and now she's rowing into spinal rotation, relatively speaking, again across a contralateral stabilization sort of position. So now I'm getting more connection from her left shoulder to her right posterior hip. So if I want to drive more thoracic rotation and contralateral posterior chain activation, and I'm also creating more, relatively speaking, internal hip rotation because it's driving her thorax towards what would be an internally rotated position through the thoracolpelvic canister related to this leg that's staying stationary. She's rotating, relatively speaking, the pelvis around that stationary anterior hip position. So again, it gives me a couple different components than the ipsilateral stabilization. So again, just to review, bring this leg forward again. So this pattern will be more ipsilateral, right side stabilized, stabilization through the TPC. Switch legs. Now we have contralateral stabilization, left hip stabilized, right scapula stabilized, and now we have stabilization across that oblique chain. So again, creates different responses in the body, even though it looks very similar. This pattern we'll use to drive more thoracic rotation than the ipsilateral pattern, and it will also create more relative internal rotation motion, relatively speaking, because of that contralateral stabilization pattern. So either pattern can be used depending on what results you want to get out of the strategy you're using.